I want to thank Ms. Pignedoli and all the MEPs who have supported Julian's candidacy for the Sakharov Prize. It was incredibly encouraging to him that this year so many MPs had gotten together, and I know that many MEPs had wanted to support the prize as well, but couldn't. Because Julian's his life is really at risk. And I'm not exaggerating. Julian has been in the harshest prison in the United Kingdom. They call it Britain's Guantanamo, Belmarsh prison, for 3.5 years, over 3.5 years. And it's extremely grim in there. And just a couple of days ago, Julian was tested positive for COVID. And that means that he's been placed in isolation, in further isolation. He spent 3.5 years in very difficult conditions in there. But when they put you in isolation, in lockdown, it means you're in a cell for 24 hours a day, and you don't leave the cell. You don't leave for a shower, you don't leave for food, you don't leave for medication. And so he's been in that cell since Saturday for about 72 hours now. Imagine that. And we don't know how long that will last. But that's just, it's a drop in the ocean of the brutality and cruelty that is being meted on Julian every day. The very existence of this case prolongs his suffering, and he's suffering profoundly. I just want to give you 2 anecdotes to show you kind of little snapshots of what's going on. The first is what happened on Saturday in London, and I don't know if you're aware, but we managed to get the most massive showing of support for Julian to date. And we actually set ourselves quite an ambitious goal, which was to surround the British Parliament. And I don't know if you've been to London, but you may know that the British Parliament on one side faces the River Thames. And to surround Parliament, that meant we had to surround Parliament on one side of the river. And then we had to cross 2 bridges and also surround and cross the other side of the Thames. And we calculated we'd need about 5,000 people to do that. And on Saturday, there was also a transport strike. So a lot of people said, well, this cannot possibly, they cannot possibly achieve this with a transport strike. Lots of people were skeptical to begin with. And when you saw the anonymous trolls on Twitter, they would say, don't show up, no one will show up. Well, we far exceeded 5,000 people. And there's footage to show it. The footage speaks for itself. We surrounded both sides of the Thames and both bridges. And in places the sidewalk was replete with people. There were easily 7,000 people. There could have been 10 or 12,000 people in the heart of London. Don't let anyone say that Julian doesn't have support. Just look at those images. And that is because the average citizen understands that what has been happening here, they have come to realize, is a brutal and primitive political persecution of an individual, a brutal persecution by a state, a cynical abuse of the law in order to keep a man imprisoned out of a punitive urge that started under the Trump administration. The charges came under the Trump administration in 2018. And why did they come under the Trump administration? Because the Trump administration knew that this case would set a precedent that would allow the US government to go after the press, to use the Espionage Act for publishing, for receiving information from a source, for possessing that information, and for making it public. The use of the Espionage Act does not mean that the US is accusing Julian of being a spy. There's no allegation of that. The Espionage Act is very broadly worded. It was introduced in 1917, in the middle of the First World War, and it was worded broadly so that it could be repurposed, and it was immediately used against dissidents who opposed the US participation in the First World War. And then, for the first time ever, under the Trump administration, that piece of legislation was repurposed to be used against a publisher. And if you look at the breakdown of the charges against Julian, he faces 170 years in relation to receiving information from a source. I'm repeating it, but just think of the process. Possessing information and making it and communicating it. The act of communicating is a crime. This is at odds with the very fundamental principles of freedom of speech and of press freedom. You cannot marry these two concepts. What is being done against Julian is an attack not only on the press, but on the ability to communicate freely and to speak the truth, and for that truth to be disseminated. I'm going to give you another little snapshot of what's going on. So the other day, I have two children with Julian, a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. And so the other day, my 3-year-old was playing in the living room with a friend of mine who was visiting. And I kind of saw from the corner of my eye that they were playing something, and I didn't understand. My friend didn't really understand what was going on. And I realized what my 3-year-old was doing. My 3-year-old was playing at being the security guard in Belmarsh prison. He was doing the wand, you know, the magnetic wand, when they do front and back. And so I'll describe to you what my children have to go to in order to see their father. So we have to go through an airlock, which means doors that close. You go through into a little compartment. One door closes. They take your fingerprints. They don't take the 3-year-old's fingerprints. They take mine. Okay. We go through the airlock. One door closes. The other one opens. After they take my fingerprints, I go through. Then we go through airport-style security, like you have here in the European Parliament. And then you go through a metal detector arch. Then you go through the wand. They go from head to toe. You have to lift your feet. You take your shoes off, obviously. You can't carry anything in. Not a paper, not a tissue. The children have to go through that too. They do the wand from head to toe, front and back, under their feet. Then we go through a second body search. They pat you down. They look behind your ears. They look in your hair. You open your mouth. They look under your tongue. They pat you down, front and back. Under your feet. They put their hands under your feet, your bare feet. And then you go through another airlock. And then another airlock. And then there's a dog search. And the dog searches you. It jumps up on you, it smells you, goes back. You have to stay still. The children have to stay still. And it's quite intimidating, a dog search. And they have to do this just to see their father once a week. Think about that. And why? What has Julian done? He published the truth about war crimes against a powerful government that is exerting its power to punish him. This cruelty is against Julian. It's also against us as a family, against my children, but also against all of you. And staying quiet is just being complicit in this atrocity. And I commend every MEP who supported this nomination, because that's what it takes. You have to raise the political profile of this case until it is absolutely impossible for the UK to extradite and for the US to prosecute. You all know what a political case is. You all know what it takes. This is a pure political persecution happening in the heart of Europe. Well, but the consequences of this case will affect all of us. And I'll tell you why. Because Julian will try to fight this all the way to the European Court of Human Rights. And what is decided in the European Court of Human Rights in relation to Julian's case will set the scope of press freedom in the whole Council of Europe area. That includes all the European countries. This is not just about Julian upsetting the US. This is not just about the UK and the US. This is a European issue. And it's also a European issue because what WikiLeaks revealed was also attacks on European sovereignty, on European citizens. Khalid al-Masri, a German citizen who was abducted and taken to Egypt and tortured, he was taken to black sites and tortured by the CIA. It was a case of mistaken identity. When they realized that, they dumped him in Macedonia. And then Germany found out. They found out the CIA had been torturing its citizen and that it was a case of mistaken identity, and they knew who the perpetrators were. And then the US Embassy intervened politically to stop any extradition, any real accountability for the people who had tortured the German citizen. We're talking about torture. We're talking about killings. We're talking about the subversion of judicial processes within Europe that we all owe Julian for having revealed, for having taken a brave position to actually hold governments to account. And WikiLeaks, Julian's idea with WikiLeaks, which he implemented, was to actually it grew out of the idea in the early 2000s, in the first decade of the 2000s, of government transparency and accountability. That is what WikiLeaks grew out of. Do we talk about transparency and government accountability anymore? I don't see it mentioned much. And that is the trajectory we're on. Because Julian is in prison, and he's been in a high security prison for 3.5 years. And before that, he was persecuted, and they used abused legal processes in order to keep him in a legal limbo where he could not defend himself and he was silenced. The trajectory of this case is clear. They have tried to attack Julian's reputation. They have tried to cast doubt over his motivations. They have tried to tarnish WikiLeaks' reputation as well. But it won't work, and I'll tell you why. Because the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, who was a skeptic, who was approached in 2019 or 2018 and said, I'm not going to look at that case because I'm not interested in Assange and WikiLeaks and what's going on. And then he was approached a second time. And then he said, well, actually, I have a duty to at least read the file. And he read the file. And then he realized he just had to scratch the surface. And what transpired was the greatest travesty of justice in the West of our times. This case is the case of our generation. It defines where we're at right now and where we're going. What happens to Julian happens to all of us because it is our right to know that is being attacked. It is a right to speak the truth. And so the Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, he wrote a whole book about it. And he said, I was propagandized. I had received all these ideas, and all I had to do was investigate. And so I wrote a book after investigating, because everyone has to know this. And it's not just Nils Melzer. There are films being made. And 5 years from now, everyone will say, well, of course, I was fighting for Assange. Prove it. Do it now. Save his life. His life depends on people sitting in this room. If you're in this room, you can do something. Help me save his life.